On the agenda tonight, the Federal Reserve does an emergency rate cut of 50 basis points, but assures all of us the economy is doing better than ever before.
Please disperse! Nothing to see here, please!
An all-out war in the Middle East is inevitable, and it will be the catalyst for a nuclear World War III.
To the frightened inhabitants, the end of the world had come.
And the stock market is in a state of confusion as the Fed forces more drugs than needed into the body of the market.
You do what I say. Snort that line. Snort the line.
All right. Today is Monday, October 7th. Welcome to our macro coverage of the day. We got a good one for you tonight, folks. In this video, we're going to talk about the Federal Reserve's policy of cutting 50 basis points out of the Fed funds rate. Was it a misguided decision? What was the reason behind it? Implications? What's going to happen from this point on? And of course, the extremely alarming geopolitical situation that we have in the Middle East and the implications on inflation and the price of crude oil. We begin with the Federal Reserve's policy. You know, it's been a few months since Barron's gave us the cover with the JP on the front of the cover, and the headline is why he won't cut rates this year. Now look at the smirk on JP's face. He's like, I'm going to embarrass these morons. You just wait and watch. But folks, any investor with a little bit of experience in the market knows that every time Barron's comes up with these big front page covers, you pretty much do the opposite. I mean, you guys remember the front covers that Barron's gave us back in the dot-com bubble, and then immediately the crash took place? It's kind of like Forbes magazine, when they tout a new face as, oh, this is the new billionaire who's going to save the world, and then it ends up being a Sam bankrupt fraud. And look at this son of a gun. The Federal Reserve actually cut rates, surprising many observers. Not just 25 basis points, but 50 basis points cuts. What happened? I thought the economy was pretty good. Why do we need all of these drugs all of a sudden? But here's the problem, folks. You would think that the Federal Reserve cutting rates by 50 basis points, that means that the rates on your loans and your credit card balances and most importantly, mortgage rates will go down. On the contrary, all of these rates actually went higher because the long end of the yield curve, if you look at the 10 to the 30-year bond yields, actually went higher after the cut by the Federal Reserve. Matter of fact, the journal says the rate cut happened, but not all borrowing costs are going down. Oops, what the hell happened here, Mr. Powell? Did you screw up again? Because this is one of these greatest mysteries of all time. You cut rates and then they go higher. One of the greatest mysteries of all time, just like what happened with 23andMe. All of a sudden, the board resigns. We're never going to hear why. One of the greatest mysteries of all time, such as flashing your Kennedy card at 70 years old, can still get you young pussy. And rumor has it that RFK Jr. seduced Olivia Newsy by approaching her and saying, and she immediately took her clothes off. The Fed cutting rates, but rates going higher is one of the greatest mysteries of all time, such as that super yacht that sunk off the coast of Italy. And the first thing that came to my mind is, wait a minute, I watched The Wolf of Wall Street. The Italian Coast Guard is one of the best. Allegedly, they rescue you and then give you wine and dance with you. In this case, they didn't even give wine. They let the whole ship sink. And now we know that there was actually some sensitive intelligence data in that yacht. Listen to this, specialist divers surveying the wreckage of the $40 million super yacht that sank off Sicily in August, killing 8 people, including the British tech tycoon Mike Lynch, have asked for heightened security to guard the vessel over concerns that sensitive data locked in its safes may interest foreign governments. Multiple sources told CNN. And I guess that's the last we're going to hear about this story. It's going to remain one of those things that are
The unexplained.
But folks, we go back to the Fed policy. You know, 50 basis points rate cut, the last time we've seen that it was back in 2007, during the mortgage crisis when the economy was on the verge of a recession. So it is known as an emergency rate cut. You usually cut 25 basis points if you're just doing the garden variety cut. Why the 25? What is the Federal Reserve afraid of? What are they hiding about the economy? Because the Fed zombies, such as Chicago Fed zombie Goolsbee, says he sees a lot of Fed rate cuts coming. Why a lot? What's going on with this economy that requires a lot of rate cuts? Because cutting rates just because inflation went down doesn't really cut it, doesn't pass the smell test. And then you got Fed zombie from Minneapolis, the demon. He says that the labor market, rest assured, folks, we're cutting by 50 basis points, but the labor market is not flashing red. Mr. Kashkari, you know what's flashing red? It's probably the marinara sauce that the government is using to cook the data. Because we got the phony jobs report saying that we created 254,000 jobs in September, right after you guys fell into the trap when the government gave you the weak data so you can cut rates by 50 basis points. And oh, by the way, they sent their dogs, the politicians, the senators, Liz Warren and the rest, giving you a letter that you got to cut by 75 basis points. And you morons fell into the trap and said, okay, you know what? They want 75. We'll do 50 so we don't look political. It's all part of a conspiracy. And now that you cut by 50 basis points, listening to the morons in Washington, D.C., all of a sudden rates are actually going higher. Why? Because inflation is making a comeback, baby. And the data about the jobs report, we lost jobs here, we gained jobs here. Who gives a shit? All of these data are fake. Now, of course, after the report, the media is touting, soft landing, soft landing, soft landing, because of this jobs data that, again, nobody can trust anything coming out of the government. I've never seen a level of skepticism by the public like this before. Why? Because we've seen insane revisions before. They give us one number, then they revise it down by a lot in the next reading when nobody's paying attention anymore. Or shall we say the algorithms of the stock market not paying attention anymore. But then you dig down, the devil is always in the details in the jobs report. This is the biggest adjustment, seasonal adjustment for any September in the past 2 decades. So they say that we created all of these jobs because of seasonal factors. Okay. Then you have the government adding 785,000 jobs in September. Did I miss the hiring spree? The FBI, the CIA, or maybe the IRS, right? Maybe they're going to do some fascism on you. Knock at your door with dogs and SWAT gear and guns to collect the $50 that you didn't report in your taxes. Maybe that's what the 785,000 jobs are really for. But we go back to the question, folks. Why the 50 basis points rate cut, an emergency rate cut that usually preserved for times when the economy is anticipating a recession or a recession is already underway? There's a huge threat to the economy. And by the way, it didn't start by the rate cuts. I mean, if you look at the issuance of T-bills, usually that's preserved during recessions. But propaganda minister Janet Yellen, the head of the Treasury, been absolutely flooding the market with issuance of T-bills, even though we're told that we have a soft landing and there is no recession. 2 problems. Either they know something that's going on with the economy and they're hiding it, or they're exhausting much-needed ammo when the recession actually hits. And again, nobody buys the bullshit of, say, for example, Zombie Waller, who says, yeah, I went with the 50 because inflation is going down faster than he expected. Will he take the 50 back now that inflation is coming back? We'll talk about that in a second. First of all, they'd never cut rates by 50 basis points just because inflation went down. They usually do it because something is wrong about the economy, the duality of the risk. And Jerome Powell has been hammering at this point over and over and over again that inflation is still a risk, but the recession risk is higher. What is he seeing? What is he hiding? Or did he get played by the fake data from the government? That's an important question that we all should ask, that the media, like the propagandists on CNBC and CNN and Fox and all of them, should begin to ask right now. Did the Fed get played by the fake data? Nobody's going to ask that question except here. And that's why you're listening to this program. At the end of the day, folks, it's the illusion of free choice. 25 basis points, 50 basis points, doesn't matter. The inevitable destination is a recession. After the huge inflation that we got, the economy right now is in life support. And this life support is running out of time. And doing the emergency rate cut, I mean, let's go back to the analogy of when there's a plane crash, because everybody talks about the soft landing. No, we have a hard landing coming. But then they drop the oxygen mask on you when the plane is about to crash. Why? Why do they drop the oxygen mask? The answer at the end of the video. But again, folks, the moment the Federal Reserve cut rates, we have seen the 10-year yield actually blasting higher. And the last time we've seen this phenomenon, listen to this, it was October 2008. Regardless what the fake government data says about the employment data and the health of the economy, you guys know that we've been getting warning after warning after warning from the corporations themselves about the health of the consumer, about the state of spending, about the state of delinquencies. I mean, you listen to a headline like this: DocuSign announces 400,000 layoffs, 3% of the total headcount. And we got a warning from FedEx. The stock went down just a few weeks ago in a massive slide because they say that we see warning on the economy. The demand for shipping, specifically expensive shipping, is plummeting. Not a good sign that we have a healthy economy. Matter of fact, layoffs jumped in August, and hiring in 24 shows a historic low, but somehow it's not reflected in the data. Either, as Peter says here, we have folks who are not filing for unemployment or filing for jobless claims because they're going with DoorDash or Uber or doing Lyft or whatever, all of these gig jobs. Or the data is being cooked, perhaps a combination of both. The market itself, folks, says that the odds of a recession are rising, not going down, rising. So again, I think that the Federal Reserve is looking at these things and they realize that the recession risk is real. But they're masking the reality, because if they got played by fake government data, that's a huge embarrassment for the Fed. Listen to Bill Dudley, the former Fed member, who said the Fed is more worried about the labor market than Powell let on. We will see what the revisions are going to look like for this September reading that we got, because this is the last reading that will be of impact before the elections. My hunch is, once the elections are out of the way, they're going to come out and say, hey, folks, did we say that we created, what was it, 285,000 jobs in September? We actually did 120,000. The rest was all seasonal factors and a little bit of extra seasoning that mixed up the number and gave us a false reading. When you look at the realities of the economy, again, duality of the risk, what does that mean? The recession risk is still here. And then you got the inflation risk. The recession risk was more dominant until the Fed cuts rates. And the Fed did cut rates. So now the recession risk takes the back seat and the inflation risk begins to come in. But that doesn't mean the elimination of the recession risk. And that's the worst outcome, because now you're facing two incredible risks. And if you're going to remedy one, it comes at the expense of the other coming back in the picture. So if we look at the recession risk, is not out of the picture yet, folks. I mean, you look at September consumer confidence, falling the most in 3 years. If the jobs data is correct, and folks are getting paid more, and finding jobs with no trouble at all, and having great job security, then why do we see consumer confidence going down to the lowest number in 3 years? And you wait, you'll see that consumer confidence number plummeting even more in the next few readings. Why? Because the Federal Reserve cut rates. And a lot of the optimism that we've seen recently is because, the Fed is going to cut rates. Things are going to get better now. I'm going to be able to afford a mortgage. Finally. Whoops, bad news for you. Mortgage rates hit the highest level in 2 months. Again, the Federal Reserve cut rates, but they go higher. Why? Because the Fed, they think they're gods. This Fed displays more hubris than any Federal Reserve in history. They think that they can control everything. And the market right now, the bond market says, no, you don't. You have control over the short end of the yield curve, meaning all the way to the 2-year yield. Once you go past the 2-year yield, the 10 to the 30, which is the most important for the rates in the economy, auto loans, mortgage rates, credit card rates, you got no control, Federal Reserve, over that. And matter of fact, when you cut at the short end of the yield curve and the bond market reads it as, that's going to increase the inflation risk and the policy will get tighter in the future, that is reflected right away in yields in the 10 to the 30 moving higher. And that's what the bond market is saying. The Fed made the biggest mistake since 2007, and the price will be the revival of inflation. Now, coward Powell, he doesn't take any responsibility of anything. He knows nothing about nothing when he said inflation is transitory. And then he capitulated at the end because of all of the pressure. But Mr. Powell never let go of the belief that inflation is not his fault. It was actually the fault of supply problems because of the pandemic. And now as inflation makes a comeback, we don't have supply problems anymore. Mr. Powell and company is going to blame the revival of inflation on what? On the geopolitics. This man is a coward. And he says, the mortgage rates, I don't have anything to do with this. I can't really fix it. You destroyed the American dream, Mr. Powell, when you lowered the rates to 0 in response to the Great Panic in 2020. The result of that, of course, is corporations, trust fund babies, scooped up all of the homes. at cheaper mortgage rates, and they turned the nation into a nation of renters. You caused this inflation crisis, and to solve it, you raised interest rates significantly higher, now making home affordability the worst in American history. And now you say that you have nothing to do with the housing crisis that we have? No, you're the destroyer of the American dream. Folks, when I say that consumer confidence will plummet even more, it ain't just the mortgage rates. You look at credit card debt hitting about $1.15 trillion, skyrocketing. This is why the economy is holding for now. It's all about accumulation of debt to spend. The bad news for the consumer, the Federal Reserve cutting rates, but the rate that you're going to pay on your credit card ain't going to go down. It's actually going higher now. And there's a thin line. Any market problem, we know that the market is in a bubble. Any fear episode that causes a market flush, a market crash, you will see companies letting go of employees, because that's what they usually do. And think about folks who are accumulating all of this insane debt in their credit cards. You lose your income, what happens next? You're drowned in this debt, and you're going to have to go delinquent. So we're just one thin hair away from a massive crisis in this economy. You look at auto loans. Car buyers face a stubborn problem that the Fed interest rate cuts cannot solve: record high prices. The prices are way too high, and by the way, auto loans rates are not going to go down. Even if you think that the Federal Reserve rate cuts will somehow save the economy because of the crisis that we have in regional banks and commercial real estate will be alleviated, forget about it. The amount of loans in commercial real estate properties that are fixed at almost $712 billion. And he got about $40 billion as distressed debt. So that's one side of the problem of the duality of the risk. The recession risk is not going to be eliminated by the Federal Reserve cutting rates because you're not going to see an impact, at least tangible impact. They're going to have to cut more and more and more. It's going to take a long time before you see interest rates dropping because right now they're actually going higher. And they're going higher because of the other side of the risk, which is the inflation risk. Now, lucky for us, we have one rational Fed member who dissented, Fed Governor Bowman. She said no to the 50 basis points. She wanted to go with 25. Why? Because she's worried about inflation. The jumbo cut, Bowman says, could be interpreted as a premature declaration of victory in our price stability mandate, accomplishing our mission of returning to low and stable inflation at our 2% goal is necessary to foster a strong labor market and an economy that works for everyone in the long term. So at least we have one Fed member who's not a zombie, at least not right now. And she has a point. You know why? Because look at the 1 month performance of commodities. Since we began speculating about the Fed cutting by 50 basis points, and they did, crude oil WTI up over 16%, sugar up over 16%, gasoline up over 15%. You see metals like palladium and grains like soybean oil, heating oil, oats, all of these commodities are jumping higher. When we talk about where do we see the reflection of rate cuts right off the gate, it ain't in auto loans or mortgage rates or credit card rates. It shows right away in commodities. It shows in bubbles in asset pricing, further exacerbating the inflation problem, which means that inflation is going higher. We're about to witness the second wave of inflation as we've seen back in the 1970s. And as we've seen, by the way, in the year 2008. But lucky for you, you can beat inflation if you do what this California man did. He tricked his neighbor to pay his electricity bill for up to 18 years. That's one way to beat inflation. But all joking aside, here's the headline from the Journal. It says, sorry, the Fed cannot save us from a bear market. For once, the Wall Street Journal says something truthful. And I was thinking about this. How do I explain this to the viewers? And I know that a lot of you are college students, and I'm always happy when I get questions from college students saying, hey, what do I study? What do I major in, Maverick? So I'm going to give you some college analogy here. See, when we get to college, everybody has this hubris. At least I did, that I can balance things. I can get really good grades, and at the same time, I can party, do alcohol, drugs, weed, and get herpes. Let's call all of that getting shit-faced. And I thought I can balance both of them. Because I'm smart, I can handle things, not like everybody says. I can get good grades and get shit-faced too. But the problem is, it comes at the expense of one another. If you spend your effort on getting shit-faced, that's going to come at the expense of your grades. If you spend your times getting good grades, you ain't gonna get shit-faced. And by the way, for college students listening to the program right now and asking, what do I major in? Talk to your advisor about studying cocaine archaeology. Listen to this headline. Cocaine found in mummified brains revealed that New World drug came to Italy 200 years earlier than thought. Somebody's getting paid to study the history of cocaine. So maybe that's the major you want to seriously consider. But we go back to the analogy. It comes down to recession versus inflation, duality of the risk. And in 2022, for example, the risk was primarily inflation. It wasn't a recession. So the Federal Reserve increased interest rates dramatically. In time, of course, the inflation risk went down, but the recession risk went higher. Now, to remedy the recession risk, they cut rates aggressively. But again, we're not sure about the data. Did the Fed get played by this recession data? Who knows? But doing the 50 basis points, at least right now, the market reaction says, comes at the expense of inflation going higher. And I know that the Fed, the hubris that they got, they think that we can get to the sweet spot of the balance and have a soft landing. Bad news, it ain't gonna happen. The best thing you can do is accept a minor recession. Because the longer you extend this game, you're gonna bring back inflation, and now you have a stagflation crisis. And when that happens, the recession, when it finally hits, it'll be deeper, longer, and more devastating. For everybody who says that inflation has been defeated, as the media and the Fed touts, you got to remember that the Federal Reserve is cutting rates by 50 basis points. We have the highest trend of inflation in history before all of these cuts that we've seen in 07, 2001, 95, and 2019. So the odds for inflation coming back after the cut is higher than all of these instances. And furthermore, you look at this chart right here. Did we forget that back in the 1970s, we also assumed that inflation is going down, we got a soft landing, it's defeated, and then it came back. The Fed made a mistake, eased too much and too early. And then inflation came back, and we've seen a second wave, which was more aggressive than the first wave. And this is why Apollo actually says that despite the fact that the Fed is promising a lot of rate cuts, as Zombie Goolsby says, they're not going to do it because inflation will force them to keep the policy tighter than many expect. They actually project that the Fed funds rate will bottom at 3%. Because of this revival of inflation, and I'm not the only one who says it's a major mistake, even Larry Summers now says the 50 basis points cut in September was a mistake. Ladies and gentlemen, if this geopolitical situation intensifies, I would not rule out that we're going to hear the term rate hikes once again. And speaking of the geopolitics, we go to the wall of worry now. And the most important item by far is the geopolitical mess that we have in the Middle East right now. Just today, in the anniversary of October 7th, we got heavy bombardment by Israel against Gaza and Lebanon, and over 130 rockets fired into Israel, coming from Gaza, from Lebanon, from Yemen, from Iraq. And the hits are now getting deeper and deeper into Israeli territory. Just last night, Hezbollah rockets hit northern Israeli city of Haifa, and the army says that the air defenses failed to stop the rockets. That's just what happened today and last night. But let's go take a step back here and assess the risks that we have and look at what each party really want. What are they after? So we know that we have Israel versus Hezbollah. Israel, of course, backed by the US, and Hezbollah backed by Iran. Let's begin with Israel. Of course, a year ago, October 7th, they suffered the biggest humiliation in their history, the biggest breach of intelligence ever, not just in Israel, but ever. Of course, Israel is trying to restore the image of deterrence and the fact that they have really good intelligence, and it was just a one-time mistake where they slipped a year ago. And is there a better way to show some results a year after the attack to your population that, look, it was a one-time mistake, and look at what we have achieved since then? This is what the Israelis were going after, at least Netanyahu. And this is why he intensified all of these attacks and widened the war right before October 7th. And he appeared to be winning after the absolutely stunning attack that we've seen against Hezbollah, when the pagers exploded all over the place, knocking out about 3,000 fighters from the force of Hezbollah at one moment, in one day. We've never seen anything like this before. Netanyahu could have just taken the win and went to October 7th, because at that point Hezbollah was humiliated, defeated, and he also got some Israeli victories that took place in Gaza. So he could have went to October 7th saying, look, I made a mistake October 7th, intelligence failure, and now, a year later, we knocked down Hamas really good, and we took over 3,000 plus fighters in Hezbollah in one shot. And he could have taken a victory lap. He was winning at that point. But of course, as any egomaniac leader, he overplayed his winning hand. And he went after the leader of Hezbollah, assassinated him, and then went into a ground incursion into southern Lebanon. This gamble, of course, did not pay off because immediately on day one, when they did the ground incursion, all of a sudden Hezbollah is killing Israeli soldiers and commandos, and it didn't work out as he anticipated. All of a sudden, now we're at October 7th. Rockets are being fired from all over the place. And oh, by the way, Iran shot ballistic missiles on Tel Aviv. All of a sudden, he got a winning card, winning hand that turned into a losing hand. And now Netanyahu, of course, looking for restoration of that winning hand at any means possible, as aggressive as he can, which is why we're anticipating the strike against Iran. Now, what is Hezbollah after? What are they looking for at this point? They suffered huge defeats and humiliation after the pager attacks. And what they want is lure Israel into a ground fight, because the aerial bombardment that Israel is doing, they have nothing or no defense against it at all. They lost a lot of weapons, they lost a lot of leaders, lost a lot of personnel, but they've been waiting for Israel to come in and invade Lebanon. And of course, Netanyahu fell into the trap. The journal says, backed into a corner, Hezbollah must make a fateful decision. The world's heavily armed non-state paramilitary group fired its first missile at commercial capital of Tel Aviv on Wednesday, its boldest response yet to a wave of strikes by Israel. It must now choose whether to unleash more of its advanced weapons, striking deeper into Israel, and potentially triggering a full-scale war, or hold back and risk diminishing its reputation as one of the fiercest fighting forces in the Middle East. So again, Israel on one hand wants to restore image. Hezbollah wants to restore image. And they got hit pretty hard. Unless Israel comes into the ground where Hezbollah can shine, they got no defense. They can't do anything. They can fire these rockets. And by the way, folks are saying, why didn't they fire the most advanced rockets? Some of them got destroyed, of course, but they got some. Problem is they lost all of the leaders. So there's speculation that there is no communication. And matter of fact, they don't even know where these rockets are any longer. And the other point is, if you fire these huge sophisticated missiles, the Israelis will catch them via satellite and strike the launching locations. And that's going to reveal where these weapons are being stored at. If you shoot smaller rockets and then the Israelis catch them and they shoot the launching pads, these are cheap launching pads. It's not a biggie. Matter of fact, Israel leaves most of them intact because why bother? But as the war intensifies, we're going to get to a point where these weapons are being used. And in the meantime, of course, Hezbollah was asking Iran to interfere. And indeed, Iran did interfere. So we go back to the board. What is the stakes for Iran? What are they looking after here? All of this, by the way, in one way or the other, is just a restoration of image. Everybody wants to have their image as a formidable force. So ego has a lot of what's going to lead us to World War III. But anyhow, a lot of folks are talking about why did Iran strike Israel with the ballistic missiles? Oh, because they assassinated the leader of Hezbollah. No, not really. That wasn't it. What happened is, after they assassinated the Hezbollah leader, Israel, there was sort of a euphoric sentiment that if we can take Hezbollah like this, all of the leaders and 3,000, 4,000 fighters in one shot, why not go after the Ayatollah in Iran? Why not do a regime change in Iran? And the Americans are going to support that. Are they going to be really against regime change in Iran? That's what they've been trying to do for years, for decades. That's why the Iranians struck. To send a message to Israel, don't do it. There's a limit. Maybe we're going to tolerate losing Hezbollah or losing some control over Lebanon, but we're not going to go down in Iran without swinging. And they shot all of these ballistic missiles in Israel. A lot of them landed. You only need one with a nuclear warhead to pretty much end the state of Israel. It's a small, tiny state, smaller than New Jersey. And Iran's strategy all along was, we don't want to get into a war. We want to drag things along the way until we develop a nuclear capacity. Headline from Bloomberg, how close is Iran to having a nuclear weapon? Look at what happened here. Once the nuclear deal with Iran went kaput, they began enriching uranium like crazy. And to be honest with you, you can just buy a nuclear bomb from North Korea at this point. And now there is speculation that there was an earthquake in Iran this morning. But it wasn't really an earthquake. It was a nuclear underground test. Oh boy. So now we go back to what's going to happen, because Iran wanted to wait all the way till they develop a nuclear weapon before they get into a war. But now that Israel is smelling blood, that it wants to go for the jugular, Iran has no other choice but to fight right now. And they did fire some missiles, which is going to prompt retaliation by Israel. And now we're all speculating. Is it going to be the nuclear facilities? Is it going to be targeting the Ayatollah or the army or the ballistic missiles facilities or the drone facilities? Or, this is what the world economy is worried about, hitting the oil refineries and oil facilities. And this is why we've been seeing crude oil spiking higher in the last few days. And there's a legitimate reason why we see the market, the global markets, not just the US market, in shambles right now. And a lot of fear is beginning to creep in because even after the strike by Israel, the assumption is it's going to be big. Be it a nuclear facility, that's the worst case scenario, or it's going to be an oil facility, which is again will have huge ramification in the global economy. Regardless of the nature of the attack, Iran needs to establish deterrence because Israel demonstrated that they can go after the leaders and knock them one by one right away. Iran woke up to that reality, which means now they have to be more aggressive. Every time Israel hits, they have to hit back even harder. This tit for tat is a dangerous game. The headline reads, Iran warns of unconventional response in case of new Israeli attack. See, if Israel attacks the nuclear facilities or the oil facilities, Iran is going to respond by bombing oil facilities in Israel and perhaps other economic targets, if not even causing civilian death. And of course, after the strike by Israel, we're going to be there. U.S. forces going to be there, anticipating to shoot down whatever response is going to come from Iran. What if something wrong happens? We get shot at instead of Israel. Any miscalculation right now will lead to dangerous consequences, and it's not out of the realm of reality. It is not far-fetched, folks. That's the scary part of all of this. Now let's go back to the board. What does the United States want at this point? Well, one thing we don't want, at least the administration doesn't want, is oil prices to go higher. And this is why President Joey B came out now on Friday and said, look, if I was Israel, I would not hit the oil facilities. And I think that the Biden administration would rather, and they've been trying to convince Israel to attack the drone facilities, because the drone facilities is two birds in one stone. You hit Iran, but you're hitting Russia too. Now, the Israelis are not really concerned about the drone facilities. Sure, they can hit them, but they want to hit something bigger, something that has economic resemblance, and most importantly, restores the image of Israel. That could be the nuclear facilities. And by the way, the other candidate, Donald Trump, he's actually okay with Israel hitting the Iranian nuclear facilities. Biden is not. Kamala Harris is not. But Trump is, because Trump has a beef with Iran. They wanted to assassinate him. And this is why I said in my video last week that Israel will bomb Iranian oil rigs. And I said two birds. A lot of viewers said, what do you mean by two birds? Well, two birds with one stone. You hit Iran, number one, where it hurts, at the economy, where the money flow is. Number two, you knock down Kamala Harris. If Israel is worried about the Biden/Harris administration restraining them, well, Donald Trump is not going to restrain them. So if you strike the oil facilities, you hit Iran, you hit the Harris administration and its election prospects. Imagine this, folks. The U.S. elections will now be determined by a tiny state in the Middle East smaller than the size of New Jersey. That's the reality. And the other question I laid on the viewers is, if there is a strike against Iranian oil facilities, the jet fighters have to do it. Where are they going to fly over to reach these Iranian oil facilities? Is it going to be over Iraq or Jordan? I don't see that as the most plausible route. In all likelihood, they're probably going to use Saudi Arabian airspace. Okay, if the Iranians get hit in their oil facilities by Israeli jets using Saudi airspace, wouldn't they retaliate against Saudi oil facilities? What do you think will happen to the price of crude if that is the scenario we're going to deal with? Now, the other challenge that the U.S. is dealing with in this whole dynamic, we're not really interested in going into a war in the Middle East. We don't want to be dragged into an all-out war in the Middle East just to defend Israel. We want to avoid a war with Iran because, to be honest with you, the Middle East is not really that important to the U.S. anymore. It used to be back when the U.S. was not the largest producer of crude oil in the world. Now we're number one. You don't need the Middle East right now. The government's focus right now is the threat of China and the threat of Russia in the 21st century. The last thing we want to do is get into a war, a prolonged war that's going to take out military resources, a lot of money, a lot of personnel to fight Iran, when the main concern is China and Russia. So the U.S. wants to avoid this war. The problem is you have Israel that wants to go the distance. It wants to restore image at whatever cost possible. And if it means a war with Iran, so be it, because they know that the American administration, be it the Trump administration or the Biden administration or the Harris administration, will be forced to defend Israel in the case of a war against Iran. There is an insurance policy for Israel that we're going to interfere in the case of war. They know that, and this is why they're going as crazy as they can. And we're losing control. We're losing influence in the Middle East. Matter of fact, the headline today in the journal was, this is the biggest headline, Biden sidelined as Israel reshapes the Middle East. We lost all influence over Israel and Netanyahu in particular. Maybe we have influence over the military leadership in Israel, but not over the leaders right now. You got to remember, the U.S. told Israel, you won with the pager attacks, leave it at there. You don't need to expand the war. You don't need to assassinate the leader of Hezbollah. Let's work on a ceasefire right now. Of course, Netanyahu said, no, I'm not taking ceasefire. I'm not taking orders from you. What are you going to do if I reject your request of taking a ceasefire deal? What are you going to do? You're going to stop the flow of weapons? You're going to stop the flow of money, taxpayer money before the elections? You're not going to do that. So Israel knows that they have the upper hand right now. That's what makes this situation right now, all the way till the elections, really, really dangerous. Knowing that the U.S. is restrained. We can't do anything until the elections are out of the way. Headline from AP says the U.S. is more hands-off than usual in the Middle East. It fears making things worse. What are they talking about? The U.S. looks like a deer in the headlight right now, says Brian Catalyst, a senior fellow at the U.S. Foreign Policy at the Middle East Institute think tank in Washington. In terms of words, deeds, and action, it is not driving events. It is reacting to events. Bingo. We're now reacting to events. We're not leading and shaping the events. And we can't do that before the elections. No administration can afford to look as restraining Israel right before the elections in November. And this is why all of this stuff talk by Biden, all of that, but at the end of the day, here's another $8.7 billion in aid package to Israel, courtesy of the taxpayer. Thank you so much. And Israel knows that. They know they're not going to lose the U.S. at all. And there's an insurance policy. If they go into a war with Iran, the U.S. will have no other choice but to interfere. So why not go the distance? Why not clean house? The final scene from The Godfather, Corleone. Just eliminate all of the family enemies. Here's where it gets really, really dangerous. Listen to this headline right here. Iranian official says Tehran to ready deployment of forces to Lebanon and Syria. Syria is the most dangerous point of all of this. Because sure, if Israel wants to go to war, Iran will not wait till they develop a nuclear weapon. Because for all they know, Israel can strike the nuclear facilities and assassinate the Ayatollah and eliminate the leadership in a couple of days. So they're going to have to go to a war with Israel. Now, would the war be in Iran? How would that work out? Maybe if the U.S. is involved. But Iran, if they sense that there is a war that's going to flare up, they'd rather have the war in Syria, right at the borders with Israel. And guess what that's going to do? The war is going to expand. Because when we talk about Syria, and we talk about the elimination of the Iranian regime, now we've involved Russia and China on the Iranian side. Russia is already in Syria. You're going to have a war in Syria, Russia's involved. And don't forget, of course, that 91% of Iranian oil goes to China now. So striking the oil facilities or going into a war with Iran will involve China because China has something to lose. And if Russia and China are involved, then you have the involvement of NATO and Ukraine on the other side. And don't forget, in Syria, we also have Turkey. They have troops in Syria. Where's that going to fit in? That's how you get World War III. And don't forget, of course, the prospect of using nuclear weapons. Here's the headline for you. Putin lowers threshold of nuclear response as he issues new warnings to the West over Ukraine. What are we talking about here? Here it is. In a strong new warning to the West, President Vladimir Putin said Wednesday that any nation's conventional attack on Russia that is supported by a nuclear power would be considered as a joint attack on his country. The threat outlined in a revision of Moscow's nuclear doctrine was clearly aimed at discouraging the West from allowing Ukraine to strike Russia with longer-range weapons and appears to significantly lower the threshold for the possible use of Russia's nuclear arsenal. If we get into a war in the Middle East and Syria, and the Russians support the Iranians, Wouldn't the US and NATO allow Ukraine to use long-range missiles to hit Russia? I think that's going to be a plausible scenario, if not even using more advanced weapons, which means that the Russians could respond with a nuclear attack. Biden, again, your taxpayer money. The spigots are wide open. Biden pledges $8 billion to Ukraine following the threat by Putin to change the nuclear rules. You look at this, folks. It looks as, okay, Israel versus Hezbollah, or backed by Iran, and Israel backed by the US. What's the big deal? They always fight in the Middle East. The game has changed now, and I think that Syria is going to be an important part of all of this. And I've been saying for a while that the war between Russia and Ukraine will connect with the war in the Middle East, and the common denominator would be Russia, because the theater of war would be Syria, where Russia's in. You see how dangerous the situation is? We could be on the verge of World War III, folks, with nuclear weapons. We've never seen this kind of threat before. And this is why even JP Morgan Chase CEO Jamie Dimon warns that geopolitics is getting worse. And I said that this is the worst geopolitical situation since the World War, maybe even bigger, because back then we didn't have nuclear weapons, and the war was concentrated in Europe. Now it's all over the place. Don't forget, of course, what's going on in the Red Sea and the threat to shipping by the Houthis bombing ships and oil tankers, the impact on the global economy. Over 15 million shipping containers. About 12% of the global trade passes through the Suez Canal, meaning through the Red Sea, where the Houthis are bombing these ships. With all of these geopolitical problems threatening the rise in price of crude oil and many other commodities and the price of shipping, do we now realize that the Federal Reserve cutting rates by 50 basis points, giving the employment data that we got on Friday, is wasting ammo and a huge mistake that would ensure the comeback of inflation and the destruction of the global economy? And on that positive note, folks, we're not through with the coverage yet. We still have part number 2, the market coverage today, because we got a lot of important moves that took place in the market today. That's going to be part number 2 of this video, and it's going to be members exclusive. The link is going to be in the comment section of this video. And you might ask, hey Maverick, how do I become a member?
It's $50 to me, plus a blowjob later on.
No, I'm just kidding. You go to the join button and you join us as a member here on YouTube, or follow the links in the description so you can follow us or become a member on Patreon. We produce the same videos. The beauty of Patreon, we're not paying Google. If you join us either on YouTube or Patreon, please make sure if you're using an iPhone that you do become a member using a website, Patreon or YouTube, because if you use the apps, you're paying the 30% to Apple. Or shall we say, I pay 30% to Apple. So 60% to Google, 30% to Apple, and we are left with nothing because they want the rent, baby. Anyhow, folks, this wraps up the macro coverage of the day, and the market coverage comes out next. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you for watching. Appreciate all of you. Love all of you. And I'm going to be talking to you again soon. Take care.
You know why they put oxygen masks on planes? So you can breathe. Oxygen gets you high. In a catastrophic emergency, you're taking giant panic breaths. Suddenly you become euphoric, docile. You accept your fate.